Hey, Eric.
Hello.
Hi, you are in the right place.
Great.
Nice to meet you. I'm Vered, and Renat is joining us. Oh, we have
Hi,
1
Eric.
minute, so
Hello.
I'll just go grab a glass of water, okay? 1 minute.
Right. Yeah, the students will come up immediately. They are always on the last moment, but they are coming in their masses. So. Hey, Asaf, good to see you as well.
Hi, Alan. Hi, Eric.
Okay, I always forget to stop recording, so it's all going to get in there. But I'm going to edit it, okay? Okay. So we'll wait 1 more minute. Everybody's still joining.
Yeah, we haven't said anything embarrassing so far, so I think it's okay.
Yes, yes. So what time is it? You're in New York, right, Eric?
Yeah, it's yeah, thanks for being flexible for my time. So it didn't overlap with one of my classes. It's just 11 o'clock in the morning. So it's really nice time. A little overcast, but that's New York City, cloudy sunshine coming in.
Really? It's not hot?
Yeah.
Because April should be nice.
Yeah, no, not yet. New York City has about 2 weeks of good weather in the spring.
Yeah.
So we're almost in that period.
Well,
You are in New York City. You are not allowed to complain. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It is forbidden
on
to
the other
complain.
end,
So I
Asaf,
want you to.
it was 28 degrees today on the other end. Although we were all
Yeah,
stuck in Zoom, but still it was 28 degrees outside for people who are actually in every life, you know.
That's also true. But still, you're stuck in New York. A bit better than Tel Aviv.
Okay. 25 and going. So we're just gonna send them a shout out. Remember, we used to send shout outs a long time ago.
Yeah, what?
It used to be like this, like a shout out. Okay.
Okay, I will write them as well.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Okay, Renat, do you want to start to talk?
Well, why not? Well, we are very honored to have with us today Eric Zimmerman. Eric Zimmerman has worked for many years, nearly a quarter of a decade in the industry, in the game industry, designing everything from you know, MMO games to hyper casual games, card games, board games, also large-scale installations. He's the co-founder and CEO of GameLab, a computer game development company based in Manhattan. And he is the author and co-authored 4 books, including the illustrious Rules of Play, which is the textbooks in nearly all game design schools around the world, I imagine. He has taught game design at various universities, and he is the founding faculty of the New York University Game Center in Tisch School of the Arts, where he's a full-time arts professor. So, Eric, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Bernard and Vered, and hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I think the way this is supposed to work is I'm going to talk. I have some slides, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my work just for a bit, and then we'll have a conversation. So should I get started with that?
Yeah, I just get you. There you go. You can share it.
Yeah.
And I just say one more thing, that together with us was supposed to be also Asi Borak, who you know, and he couldn't make it, so he sent his love, regards, and everything, and we'll send him the video.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Asi, also for helping make this happen. And it's really nice to meet all of you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So let's get going. I will just share a screen, and let me get Keynote. So I just have a few slides to just sort of talk a little bit about my work and just familiarize you with a few things and give you a sneak peek at a couple new projects that are just starting to happen. So this blurry image is my first commercially released game, and I think it was 1995, was Gearheads. I was actually a graduate student and got an internship at a game company and ended up working at a company in New York City that did interactive work, including making games in the very stylish medium of CD-ROMs at the time. So this was a game called Gearheads that was about toys that you would release on either side of the playfield, and you march towards the center, and you were trying to get them across the field and across the line to score points for you. I think what was one of the things that I found interesting about this is that the toys that you release you don't own or control anymore. So this is kind of so they all do different things. The bulldozers can push toys, so you might release it, but then your toy gets pushed and used by the other player. The kangaroo up there on the upper right can punch toys forward, so maybe you have some light toys and then release the kangaroo behind it. So even in this kind of this early work, I was very interested in the way parts of systems interact together, and that playing the game means not just playing the game that you're playing right in front of you, but also exploring a larger set of possibilities. Sissy Fight was a game that I did a little bit later, a few years later in my career. I was freelancing and I worked with a company called Word.com. And Sissy Fight was a game about little girls on a playground in a social conflict, and it's inspired by sort of game theory and classic Prisoner's Dilemma. So in the game, you're trying to reduce the self-esteem of the other girls. So that's what those hearts are. But you have to work with the other girls. So if you tease another girl, for example, it doesn't do anything. But if two or more girls tease the same target, then the self-esteem goes down. And it's a turn-based game, and the success of your actions depends on what other people do, and it involves a lot of communication. So it is not a game for children, but it is a very kind of darkly humorous game about childhood. This game was interesting to me in other ways. It kind of continued some interest in systems, but it also was more of a social system. And that really, to play the game has to do with how you interact with the other people. It also created social systems outside of the game. This was the first game I worked on that really had a very, very large fan community. And in fact, there's still a version of the game that exists today online. And there were all kinds of examples of creative play and cheating and misbehavior and vigilante and fan art and events and things like that was bubbling up in the early internet years of the late 90s and early 2000s. I should also say that this game was very much a feminist intervention into the culture of games. Everyone plays a girl, so everyone is gendered female, but the girls themselves don't fall into the either princess to be rescued or kind of pin-up action hero, Lara Croft. Instead, they're sort of cute, sort of ugly, kind of tough, kind of mean. And we were exploring also different kinds of identities that players may have in the game. I ended up forming after that a company called Game Lab with the co-founder Peter Lee. We were a studio of about 30 in New York City, and we made a lot of games. So we were focused mostly on what are so-called casual games, although I don't really like that term. What musician says I make casual music, but we were doing games for a mass audience. We worked with companies like Lego. We did original games. That game Diner Dash was probably our biggest hit. We also worked with nonprofit organizations. that game Aidi was actually done with a company with Global Kids and Games for Change, which is an organization that Aussie has worked with in the past. So we were also a game about poverty in Haiti, so that we collaborated with high school students to create. So Game Lab made a lot of projects over about 10 years. One of the things that Game Lab created was a project called Game Star Mechanic, which is a game in an online community that let kids create their own games, funded by a large grant from the MacArthur Foundation. So all this time I was teaching game design as well as a part-time instructor, and also I was interested in the sort of blurring the boundaries between players and designers. The Institute of Play, which was created from my commercial studio Game Lab, went on to become its own very successful nonprofit organization that ran for about 10 years. And they created whole schools where the whole model of learning was based on play and games. So I was never sort of on staff full time there, but I was always on the board of directors and was involved with the organization. I also have done many other kinds of projects. This is a screenshot from a Xbox Connect title. That was the console where it sort of sensed your body, that I collaborated with a company that was called Leela, and was a game about sort of looking at the intersection of meditation and play. I also do tabletop games, as Renan mentioned. This is the Metagame, which is a social party game that I did with Colleen Macklin and John Sharp, and was one of the inspirations for Cards Against Humanity, although it's very not the same game. And this is just another example of a more straightforward sci-fi strategy board game, like a 14-year-old boy power fantasy game called Quantum as well. So do a lot of different kinds of games. I'm also a professor, as Renard mentioned, at the NYU Game Center in New York City, and we have a whole a bachelor's program and a master's program there with students studying games, focused on games as a form of culture in the School of the Arts. I've also, as Renard mentioned, co-author of Rules of Play and the Game Design Reader with Katie Salen. And I also do large-scale installations. Architect Natalie Pozzi and I together create these projects. This was at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, DC. This is from an installation in Paris called Interference. That is these sort of hanging walls with little pieces that you move around. These projects tend to combine the fields of architecture that Natalie Pozzi are in, and game design that I'm in. They're playable installations. They're games that you play with your body, with other people, and they're often quite beautiful sculptural objects too. These walls are extremely thin, like millimeter thin filigree metal. That's laser cut, and then the little pieces that move around are wood in them. And they all sort of try and break the rules of conventional gameplay in some way. This one is called Interference, and you interfere in other people's games. So you and a partner are playing together, but to make a move in your game, you have to interfere in someone else's game and grab a piece and put it in your own. The most recent project that Natalie Pozzi and I did was called Waiting Rooms, and it was inspired in part by her experience of the American immigration system and bureaucracy. And it's less of a sculptural installation like some of the other projects we've done, and more of a building size performance that takes over a whole series of rooms that are interconnected by lines on the floor that you follow on tape, like a whole network of different situations that you find yourself in. And each situation is almost like a strange little social experiment that has different rules that you need to follow. More recently, a few years ago, I worked with Local Number 12, that's Colleen Macklin, John Sharp, and Peter Barry, and a bunch of other folks to make Dear Reader, which was a game that's now in the Apple Arcade. That was a launch title for them, and still doing quite well. And I'll just show you a quick quick video. I think I'm going to unplug my sound, so it's just going to play through the speakers. That's probably the best way. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Music, yeah. So this is a game that is about, it uses public domain English literature like these books as the basis for word puzzle games. For example, Pride and Prejudice. And it takes the actual text from the book, so actual little snippets from each chapter that we curate, and it turns them into puzzles. So this gives you a sense of all the different ways that we play with language. And then it sometimes is words or lines or letters. You're filling in blanks, you're moving things around, you're finding things that we've put in that you need to delete, and you're collecting books over time and making a whole library of books. So it's kind of a love letter to literature, but also building on, you know, my longstanding interest in making games for sort of broad audiences. Let me just get my headphones in. Okay, so last thing, I'm just going to give you a sneak peek at a couple new projects. So this is a game called Rats, High Tea at Sea. So during the pandemic, I was collaborating with game designer Josh DeBonis, and we were trying to design a game that was specifically designed for remote video play. And so we ended up with this game, which is it's sort of a roll and write game. If you're a board game geek, you might know what that means, but this is a very social one where everyone is playing rats on a sinking ship. And the rats are ignoring the sinking ship and instead just throwing a big party. So it's kind of was how we felt during the pandemic, that the world was kind of burning and no one really cared. But it's also a fun and kind of nasty social game. And we're working on getting this published. One of my interests in publishing this game is I'm very interested in sustainability, and in part fueled by my collaboration with Natalie Pozzi, who's also driven to incorporate sustainability into her design and architecture practice. I've been trying to find ways of publishing tabletop games more sustainably, and I'm still working on that idea. The last thing that I want to show is, and I have to say, this is the very first time that anybody is seeing this. I've talked about this before, but you're all getting a very first of the world sneak preview of The Rules We Break. So this is a new book that I am, you're seeing screen grabs of the final manuscript that I'm editing right now. But I thought it was relevant to talk to a group of game design students about, so I'm just going to give you a little peek into this. This is a book that I've been working on for the last few years, and it is based on all the ways I teach game design. So as Bernard mentioned, I've been working in the game industry for close to 30 years, but I think, but lots of people have made games, but I think one of the more unique things from my background is that I've actually been teaching games for that long, teaching game design. And so I really feel I have this whole storehouse of knowledge. And while Rules of Play is about ideas and concepts, this is much more about exercises and activities around about game design. So it's divided into 3 sections. There's play, and then systems and design. And each section has these little tiny essays that are in the upper right, you can see, and then exercises, actual projects or activities that you can do. You see down here under systems, modding tic-tac-toe, or Golf, which is beanbag golf. So they're all often physical games or tabletop games. These are not computer games that teach principles in game design. And again, I'm just giving you a sneak preview. No one has seen this before, but these are the little one-page essays that I mentioned. So in systems, play, and design, each of these 3 sections has a series of small essays that all take on a little topic. Being Someone Else is about play and identity play or role-playing play. Collaborative conflict is also in the play section, and it's about the idea that conflict is something that's also collaborative in the context of games. But the main part of the book are these actual exercises that you can play, and the book takes you through them. In this case, it's a social game, 5 Fingers, where it's kind of a game where you point at someone and they lose a finger. But it has a lot of lessons about how games create meaning, how play can be kind of nasty and transgressive, but also playful and joyful all at the same time, and also about how how players can take a system and be creative within that system. So that's just wanted to show you a little sneak peek at the rules we break. And I think, how am I doing for time? That's been about 15 or 20 minutes. So I think I will end it there. I'll stop sharing and come back to Zoom. So anyway, oh yeah, so thanks, and I'm looking forward to chatting more and hearing questions or hearing about what you're all up to.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, we're going to open up for questions, but I just have to ask one thing before that, because you were actually tapping into a question I wanted to ask you, and I wrote it down. I said, how do you teach game design? You know, because I mean, yeah, and then you talked about this book, which is even more interesting because we use your book for so many years. You know, Rules of Play, yours and Katie Salen books. And I was wondering if you can say just a few words. How different is this book from Rules of Play in a way? Because it's 20 years later, and you know, and 20 years of experience teaching students game design. What has changed?
Oh my gosh, you're
in
making
a nutshell,
me feel old.
Yeah.
That book came out 20 years ago.
Yeah.
No, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk about that. You know, the funny thing is, yeah, some things have changed. Sometimes I read Rules of Play and I think, oh my gosh, that book is so obsessed with definitions and defining concepts, and you know.
But it was groundbreaking.
On the other hand,
it was groundbreaking.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Everything in a
Thank
book,
you.
You know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's other great books about game design too, many of which came out around the same time. But thank you for saying that. I would say that the other half though of it is that, you know, not that much has changed. I mean, what I think is interesting about what Katie and I did is that we weren't just looking at video games, we weren't just looking at technology, we weren't just looking at the sort of the business patterns or platforms of the day. And we really try to take a long look. We really try to say, hey, look, games and play have been around for thousands of years. And what are the things that when we look at early video games, ancient tabletop games, sports, the ways that people play with each other today, what are the common things, and you know, what does it mean to understand what a game is and how people play them and how they can be designed to produce meaningful experiences for people. So those things haven't changed. And the way that I teach game design with my students I'm not a programmer myself. My background is in art. I studied studied painting as an undergraduate, and I have a graduate degree, a master's in art and technology. Although I played games my whole life, when I was around, there weren't game design master's programs like the one that you're all in. Because I'm not a programmer, I know a little bit of programming, but that's not the role that I play on projects. When I teach students, we're mostly working off the computer. So we're looking at making board games and card games and physical games and social games. I've been very inspired by Bernie DeKoven, who passed away a few years ago, but he was the author of The Well Played Game. And he really taught a lot through playground style games and that kind of physical and social play. And increasingly, I also incorporate those kinds of playground style activities into my teaching, where I get everyone up, we get out of the room, we play with each other. And I find that those exercises work really well, both in academic settings and also in industry settings. When I'm giving a workshop to professional game designers, that also is a way of getting everyone to feel loose and creative and free and think about playing games in a different sort of way. So, you know, for me, a class is about doing things, and it's just a situation where the professor kind of gives people problems to solve, and we can talk about them and have concepts about them. So maybe when Rules of Play was written, Katie and I were really thinking about what's the critical language, what are the concepts that we need. And my focus now in teaching is less about what's the way to define something, and it's more about what are we doing here together? How are we talking about it? And how is this a situation that can help us understand design? I should say that Rules of Play, the new book, which is called The Rules We Break, is not just for game people. So one of the things that I've realized is that what we all practice, what you all are studying, things like systems thinking, the relationship between structures, and then playful experiences, how to collaborate with each other across disciplines, how to iterate and prototype and playtest and solve problems through experimentation. Those are incredibly valuable skills that I think are relevant for just about anybody working in software, working in business, working in arts, working in design fields. And I actually think that we have a lot we can offer other fields, in part because we're so focused on kind of making engaging experiences. Because, you know, if someone is designing like an app that lets you, I don't know, download your medical information, it might have a really bad interface. It might be horribly designed, but if you can suffer through it, you need to do it and get it done. But if you download a game and start playing, and you know the first 30 seconds are not engaging, you move on to the next one. So we're really kind of like, we game designers, all of us, and I mean all of you, we really have to become like ninjas of experience design, that the things that we make really live and die by the kind of moment-to-moment way that they engage with people. And I think for that reason that we become very, very skilled at all of the things that I mentioned, systems thinking and collaboration and iteration. And we have a lot that we can offer other fields. So sorry, this is a very, very long answer to
I have like
question.
a million questions to ask, but I'm going to let Renata and other people, because this can be a very long conversation.
Yeah, sorry, interrupt me so we can move on to something else.
Guys, the stage is yours, guys. Yeah.
I had a follow-up question. I want to ask, can you tell us about a game that you think or are you sure it didn't work, but nowadays, because of the technology, it can work and be successful?
A game that didn't work, but because of the technology, it can work. That's a really interesting question. You know, when I'm designing for a platform, I always try and think about what's a game that is sort of native to that platform, right? Like rather than, I think like, let's talk about smartphone games, for example. When smartphone games first came out, or let's say when phone games first came out, even before smartphones, for those of you that can remember, they weren't that great. And a lot of them were, people were trying to put like arcade games, or I don't know, text adventure games, or things that were really designed for mouse and keyboard or an arcade machine experience into the phone, and they just didn't work. And smartphone games really took off when people started leveraging the unique capabilities of the platform. So for example, the idea that it's always with you, so that it can send you messages, or that you can play in very short bursts, and you know, while you're waiting for the bus or on the subway, or that it's social, so that it can incorporate interaction among players, or that you can post your high score to an online list. So I think once people started taking advantage of those unique affordances of the platform, then the games got more interesting. And I just think that's a good general lesson. I know I'm not really answering your question, which is a really good question. I'm sort of saying, for me, when I'm working on a platform, I really try to think about that platform as opposed to, oh, I have a great game and it's just waiting for technology to advance in order to get there. But yeah, but now I guess, you know, I think one thing that's been interesting over my career is that video games started as very single player experiences for decades. You know, they were really solo, and in a sense, digital games are more and more social. Like even you know, sort of single player console games are getting more multiplayer in interesting ways, whether they're, you know, direct interaction like Fortnite, or they're they're very indirect, like, I don't know if you've heard of the American game Wordle, which is a little word game.
We actually have an Hebrew version to it. Yes.
Right. So, and in that case, it's not a social game, but there's sort of a social community as we're all kind of playing with each other and posting scores. So I think that in that sense, I think that these ancient ways that humans play with each other, that social, are getting more and more possible on digital platforms. So, you know, here I'll try and answer your question. There's a colleague that at the Game Center, Charles Pratt, who's also a professor there, who said that, you know, game designers should design less. We should stop designing tennis and we should start designing more tennis balls, meaning that like a tennis ball is a thing that in the real world, we can play tennis with it, but we can do all kinds of things with it. We can throw it at each other. We can use it to decorate. We can get a whole bunch of them and juggle them or invent other games. So to me, that's also maybe what's interesting about as technology gets more flexible, is thinking less about here's a tightly designed experience and here's more of a toolbox for players to invent things. And maybe something like Minecraft is a little bit like that. But for a long time, video games were much more kind of rigid. So anyway, thanks. It's a super interesting question.
Who's next? I have some questions here that you've asked.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about anything. You know, maybe there's a different situation in the game industry here in, you know, in the United States where I am, or game academia. It could be a more practical question.
I want to ask about inspiration. Like,
okay,
you can do games about many things. How in your in the game that you developed, what was the inspiration, or how was the process in that?
That's an interesting question too. I think that there's a couple things. My trajectory, like I said, is I started off as an artist, or at least studying art, painting and art technology, and working like as a solo practitioner. So the traditional art thing is, you know, you go in your studio and you make art. It's really all about you and your ideas and things that you want to express. And I think that as I kind of shifted in my career to being a designer, I realized, you know, it's not really about me. It's about working on teams with people. And in a sense, I think everyone working on a project has to be an author, which is, you know, in some ways that's great. It opens up projects to more minds, but also means that there's kind of lots of ideas and things going on. So I think one thing I think about is, you know, setting up processes so that everyone on a team can kind of start collecting a common set of inspirations together. So one thing is thinking about, you know, having groups defining what interests them, why are we working on this, what interests us, and if you can come up with a kind of creative challenge or statement that sort of collects your interest together, then you can start looking for references and doing research around that. So I think that's one approach. I know that I'm not really answering your question directly. It's a really good question. I also think that for me personally, in terms of what inspires me, because I'm always trying to look outside of games and look at forms of culture that aren't games. I think one of the challenges that we have as in game culture is that I see a lot of my students are, you know, they're big game fans, which is great. They're really literate in different genres of tabletop games or video games, but they often, in terms of aesthetics and content and gameplay, they're just sort of making games inspired by other games. And I think that, you know, if you look at cultural media like music and film, they're not just inspired, obviously, by other music and film. There's, you know, you see artists looking at the kind of the whole world around them. So for my students, I try and set up processes and situations where they can do that. Sometimes we go on field trips to museums and galleries and see fine art together, or I'm always trying to bring in readings or examples of cultural work that's not games, just to get them inspired and open up their eyes a little bit. So I think that for me, hopefully, you know, my own inspirations, it's a lot of things. Sometimes it's more structural. Like I said, like Gearheads to me was interesting because of the kind of the systems and structure and formal elements. Other things can be interesting to me because of the kind of the content of the game. you know, and in terms of something like Dear Reader, we were really interested in how games related to literature. Like, can we use, not tell our own story, but have like include all these stories from all these famous books as the raw material that you're playing with. And in the case of the Rats game that I showed you, it was more about trying to think about things outside of the game, right? The kind of cultural situation and context, and sustainability, and playing with each other remotely because we can't play in person. So it comes from a whole variety of different places. I hope that answers the question. Again, a long answer to a good question. Sorry about that.
Excellent.
We have another question here in the chat, and then I will
okay,
propose one myself. But Ben is asking, what is the designer researcher's place in the commercial game dev ecosystem? Can you identify the contribution made by academics that were implemented in the mainstream industry?
Oh, that's super interesting. That's an interesting question. Okay, I think there's a number of, here's what I think. Maybe this will be, maybe I'll push, I'm gonna push against the presumption of the question. I actually think that academics and researchers do not need to define their value by how the work that they do is adopted by the industry. And actually, I see, sometimes I've seen conferences that are a mix of academics and designers, and a designer might say, okay, that was an interesting paper, but how does that help me make a better game? And I think that research is that's not necessarily what research is about. That if you're a psychologist or critical theorist or technologist, you're not, I mean, sometimes you want to do work that has more immediate application, but not always. And I actually think my answer to that kind of designer that says, how does this help me make a better game? You could say, you could go to a symphony orchestra performance and say the same thing. How does this orchestra performance help me make a better game? Well, that's up to you. That's up to you to get inspired. It might be directly inspired. I want to put this music in my game, or you might be inspired by the kind of the structural way that the music is put together, the gestures of the conductor. I don't know, the ritual performance of sitting in seats in front of an orchestra, how they collaborate with each other to make music. I want to make a game that feels like I'm playing in an orchestra. There's a lot of ways to be inspired by that. So I kind of feel that way about academic research, that I would like to move the onus or the responsibility not on the academics, but onto actually the industry, if the industry wants to take advantage of them. That sort of goes both ways. There's a lot of there. That said, I will try and answer the question now. So that's my first response is, I never want to make academics feel bad, because sometimes you're doing basic work, or you're doing, the thing is, if you're a sociologist, your field is sociology. It's not game design. And you might be studying people in games to better understand communities or social psychology or how humans behave. And that doesn't mean that it's immediately applicable to making games. On the other hand, there are a lot of overlaps. There are sociologists now who work with, League of Legends, for example, hires psychologists and sociologists to help them reduce the toxicity in their community. But in that case, they're applying their understanding of people to industry context. And it's not necessarily their actual white papers or research. I also think that academics like me that are educators have a huge impact on next generations of game developers. So in that sense, we really do influence the industry in a more gradual way, but in a very direct way. And for example, it's a huge message of that I tell my students that, there's being a game designer, there's two sides, right? There's the craft of game design, but there's also the culture of game design. And by that, I mean, there's so much craft in what we do, understanding rules and systems and how to design characters to make them engaging and how to design interactivity and how to work on a team and how to manage, you know, software production, scope issues and all of that kind of thing. But you also always have to acknowledge that there's culture too, that our whole world is designed, that the clothing that we wear, that the food that we're digesting, the rooms that we're all sitting in now, the technology that's allowing us to even have this conversation, these are all designed, and game designers also contribute to this world. And we have to think about our responsibility and our role in doing that and contributing to a media landscape of pop culture, or to a set of representations, or to a set of capitalist practices that might have to do with labor and revenue models, dark design patterns that try and trick people into paying money for loot boxes or whatever it is, right? That's also part of what we as academics do to kind of influence the industry. But you know, for me, I would like academics to feel more like the researchers. I would like them to feel I don't want to say privileged, but special. Like I would like them to be snobs. I think it's okay to be a snob of your discipline and say, hey, I'm doing really important work in you know, psychoanalytic film theory as it relates to, you know, video game displays. And if you don't appreciate my work, that's okay. It's okay to do work that's requires expert knowledge to understand. Academic research doesn't always have to directly impact industry.
So before there are so many other questions, I just want to ask you as to this question. So do you think that, because you're sort of a designer researcher in a way, so do you think that your position allows you to be more ethical in a way? You know, because I'm thinking even about Diner Dash. You think, because it was also, you know, revolutionary in a way about the way it presented women in games, and it was such an important game actually for all the, you don't like the idea of casual games, but for all the other games that came up later, you know, that tried to appeal to a new audience, to the female audience.
Right.
So you think, I mean, as the position of a designer researcher, you're more involved in ethics and morals than just other game designers?
I don't know. At the time that I made Diner Dash, I was not a full-time professor. I was just teaching one class a week. So really I was working in the industry and I was running my own studio. We were an independent studio trying to stay alive and not run out of money. But thank you for saying that about Diner Dash. I think I agree. We were really focused on opening up new audiences, and we were trying to make a positive character. You know, all of the sort of feminist frequency ideas of tropes of female characters in games at the time that we were making them in the early 2000s, it was really, really prevalent, right? This is before today's indie games and queer and trans game makers that were that are speaking about their own experience. So on the other hand, I feel like, and we had the character designer and narrative designer of Diner Dash was a woman manga artist who, you know, brought a huge amount to that role on the team. I would say that you know, on the other hand, Diner Dash is sort of goofy. I mean, it has other problems. I think ideologically, it's like a fantasy about capitalism, and it's very uncritical about, oh, I'm gonna be a waitress and now I'm gonna open up my own restaurant and it's gonna get bigger and bigger and earn more money and buy things. And you know, it's you can't necessarily question everything, but you know, to me, Diner Dash is a little bit playing into these fantasies about that kind of blur the lines between achievement and monetary success. And but that's, you know, that's where we're then. But I would say that, yeah, no, I wasn't, Brad, I wasn't, yeah, I was a working game designer then. So again, I think that everyone making games needs to be, okay, I'll put it this way. For all of you, I think that the most important cognitive skill we have as game designers is being able to put on different hats, right? Because sometimes when you're balancing a game, you need to be like a mechanic of numbers. And you're like, why aren't all of my characters beating the first boss? Well, you have to, like, it might be a spreadsheet problem. It's like, well, they're not earning enough gold to buy the buffs to level up to, you know, actually have the stats to beat the boss. But they might have a different problem. Later on in the same development of the same game, how come nobody even remembers the name of our main character, right? So then that's a different problem. That might have to do with storytelling or understanding your audience, or managing their expectations, or changing the relationship that they have to the protagonist, so that they do remember her name in the game. So that's one hat, and then another hat is like the you know, as you say, the ethics of understanding how we relate to cultural context outside of games. And I just feel that that's another hat that we have to put on. So I would say that for me, that's just part of being a designer. You know, even as I've learned from collaborating with an architect, I mentioned Natalie Pozzi, when architects do a project, they never just drop a building down on a block. It's always a study of the context. You always think about not just who's going to use your building, but how your building relates to other buildings on the block, how it contributes to the kind of texture, how it is a part of the community. And often there's even community processes where there's you can get input and buy-in from people that are living in the neighborhood about the design of the building or what's being planned there. So I would love to see game designers have that kind of approach to what we do. Again, it's the culture, but also the context part as well.
Jared, may I pop in for just a quick remark? Well, I'm delighted by what you're saying, because this is exactly what I'm teaching. I'm not coming from game design. I'm a theorist, so it's cultural studies. I'm also a graphic designer, but I serve as a theorist here. So I'm very delighted, and for all the students who are wondering why I'm teaching them, I don't know, technology and society and everything, so this is why. But I'm wondering, because I think many times it is not really overlapping, but rather conflicting areas. And then, you know, when you are saying I need to design something very appealing that will go to lots of people, so it's not going to be very deep, and it can't be very sophisticated, but then you would like to promote some notions that might be not so appealing. I don't know, like I don't know, protest against capitalism or whatever. I don't know. So I mean, I see lots of times conflict between the one side, the one head, as you said, that wants to go deeper into understanding of culture, and then the other head that says, yeah, but design it very simple and very appealing, so it will go to the common denominator, which is usually not very deep. So any suggestions or tips for how to solve this tension?
Well,
if you agree that there is.
Yeah, there is a tension, but I think it's really interesting tension. Let's put it this way. Let's say that we were all chefs and we were designing food, right? Some people might be designing new forms of candy. Some people might be designing elegant meals. Some people might be focused more on the problems of, you know, delivering food in an institutional setting where you want to sort of have a limited budget, but you want to really provide people nutrition, but also a good experience. There's certain things that we all really do need to understand in order to for any of that. You know, there's things like there's technical things like nutrition and the process of food, but I would also say that to make food appealing in any of those contexts, candy, in a cafeteria, a company cafeteria or a school cafeteria, in a fancy banquet, depending on, you know, what you're doing as a chef, you still need to think about human desire, right? And how it is that people think, how they relate to their food. I actually think that food is really similar to games in that, you know, food is about it's about pleasure and gratification in a very physical way. I think that, and we consume food the way that often feels like we're kind of consuming these experiences with games. And so, you know, when you're a chef, it's so much about sensual pleasure. And I feel the same is true with games, right? It's a way of looking at games, that it's about dancing with the desire between the player and the system, or between two players in a fighting game as they're sort of providing the challenge for each other. So I guess I'm just using these examples to say that that if we can understand people and culture and context better, it's going to help us. Even if your goal is to make a lot of money, you're trying to do a successful game, you need to understand the media landscape into which you are trying to advance your culture. And I think what we often see is that the game industry, like any form of media, mass media or pop culture, it's really overflowing with copycats, right? This game did this, I want to do something similar. It's stuck in genres, unimaginative ways of that people are doing. So I think it's, I think there's many ways to innovate, but you do need to think creatively about what you're doing. And that's one of the great things about being in school, is that you can experiment. I think none of your professors think that you're here just so that you can imitate what's going on in the industry, that they want you to figure out who you are as an artist or designer and what you individually can contribute to evolve this cultural form that we're all still figuring out. So in terms of your question, I think, whether you're trying to innovate on the level of aesthetics and bringing in visual or audio languages from other cultural fields, whether it's more on the level of psychology and pleasure and desire that I was talking about, or whether it's on a political level, that you want your game to not just be a part of, I don't know, capitalist exploitation, but question it, right? I think that you have to figure out where you want to innovate. And as you leave school and go out into the world, there's so much that's wrong with how we make games in terms of how teams are put together, how games are funded, whether or not people share in the success of the game that they contributed to. And for me, all of this stuff relates directly to what you're talking about in kind of critical theory, critical studies, and understanding how games relate to the culture that surrounds them. So, if someone wants to make great pop culture, I think that that's amazing. And I think there's so many examples of really powerful culture that can be about personal expression, from, hip hop, rapping, to, like, I don't know, I'm thinking of dance or graffiti culture. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a direct political statement in order to be a powerful cultural statement. But if you're not acknowledging that kind of cultural dimension, it's like your game is missing out on those opportunities to be expressive and successful as pop culture. Again, I'm sorry, you all are giving me such deep questions. It's taking me a while to kind of think through them. So I appreciate you being patient as you're basically hearing my thought process as I'm talking to you. But it's really nice, really nice set of questions that you're asking.
We have another question here in the chat from Alad. Were you ever confronted with a dilemma between a great concept but the lack of means to realize it? And how do you approach a solution?
That's a really good question. I think that, I don't know, for me, it's just sort of like a pyramid, right? At the bottom of the pyramid are like all the ideas I have for games, all the hundreds or thousands of ideas. I put them in notebooks. I write, I keep track of them. I think of them, I forget them. Some of those I go a little bit farther and try and say, hey, let me think a little deeper. Can I make a prototype, or let me work this out a little bit? A few of them might even start as projects with a team, a personal team, or maybe it's something that I did for a client but never got realized. And a smaller number really go into production, and then some smaller number of those actually get launched. There's always going to be a lot more ideas than things that you can release. So I think it's okay. It's okay that you have a lot of ideas that don't get realized. And I would say that the development scope, both for students where you all are, and also once you get out, it's one of the biggest constraints, and it is always there. I know we think like, oh, once I'm in working at a real company or a big studio, then I'll finally have the resources to do what I want, but I'll be doing what someone else wants, like they'll be above me. So, but the truth is that there's always going to be extremely strong production constraints on what you do as a designer. and developer. And I've always worked on the smaller end of things. My company, Game Lab, we made games. Most of our games were teams of about 5 to 7 people. I have worked on much bigger teams, but generally I like working on the smaller end because of the creative freedom and the flexibility. And I love the constraints of having to think small. And it also means that I don't spend 2 or 3 years working on just one game. I can, work on many smaller projects and get them out into the world sooner. But it's good practice to think about, okay, if you have an idea and you feel like it can only be realized in this giant way, what's the small way that you can do it yourself or with a small group of people? Elad, I guess that would be my challenge to you. Like, what is really important? For example, you're imagining a big AAA 3D MMO game. Well, which of those things is really important to you? Is it about the world and the characters? Because maybe it could be a 2D game where you explore that world and characters. Is it about the social interaction? Can it be, I don't know, a tabletop game where you really explore the social interaction in a direct way? I know these are silly examples. I'm sure it doesn't really apply to what you're saying, but that's design thinking. Is I have these ideas, I have these constraints, and how do I move forward step by step? That's what game designers and really all designers do constantly. So kind of what you've articulated in your question, which I think is a really good question, it's one of the fundamental challenges that it never goes away. So I guess my answer is sorry, but get used to it. It's going to be there. But I guess enjoy it. You got to enjoy it. I guess that's the flip side.
Thank you. What if it is a really small thing that you want to do, but it is really far-reached?
I don't know, find collaborators, even if it's small. I mean, again, I'm not a programmer. I have to find people to work with. Finding collaborators that are also excited, and that's another way to move an idea forward.
Thank you.
What's your take about regional games? You were creating games like Diner and Dash in the heydays of globalization, and hopefully globalization will continue, and also wrote at this period. But now with all this talk about regional games, do you think there's a place for a Taverna Dash or some games that comes from a different culture and different gameplay coming in?
Yeah, are you saying, Renard, you're saying like, is there a place for original games as opposed to what kind of games?
To the tendency to take globalization and casual games as a global phenomena and kind of erase anything of the local in order to apply to a mass culture, to a mass audience.
Yeah. Oh, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the way pop culture works in fields like fashion or music, there's a constant recycling of local culture into pop media forms. What was I was just what's their name? Amadou, and there's a pair of I think they're Senegalese musicians that are now living in Paris that do sort of like Afro pop inflected, now more Western pop music. And when someone like that is that I've just that I just been listening to, someone like that is they're not, in other words, I think there's a way of doing both, maybe. That local culture doesn't have to mean a kind of a static sort of, here's my folk village that I am, presenting to the world in an unchanging way. But I also have a point of view given everyone's kind of cultural background. So I think there's a place for both. I also think there's a lot of interest in. There's always room and interest for, kind of exploring and expanding people's cultural influences. So yeah, definitely it's definitely there's I don't know, there can be something. I mean, once something reaches a level of kind of a global genre, it's sort of watered down. It's a little bit lifeless at that point, right? It's really these sort of more local cultures, again, whether that's coming from more traditional culture, whether it's coming from a local form of experimentation and appropriation and remixing of global cultures that energizes these. It's really a cultural ecosystem that we're talking about, right?
Farah, do we have a time for last question? Because Adi was...
Yes, Adi, one question. Yes, Adi, do you want to ask it? Or?
I wrote it. When I could read it, it will be great.
Yes, go ahead, read it, Adi.
What's this laziness, Adi?
Yes,
About laziness.
you're narrating your questions.
Nobody reads the instructions, right?
Exactly.
So it's how do you approach enriching player experience through core mechanics and game loops? And what methods do you use to introduce those mechanics?
That's a really interesting question too. I think one of the early questions that was about designing for platforms, I think from Danit, I talked about really trying to get into the affordances of the platform. And I think that for me, the core mechanics emerge from those affordances. You know, what can you do? What's a new thing to do with a deck of cards? What's a new thing to do with a mouse and a keyboard or the object of a smartphone? I'll share with you one trick. We just had as a guest speaker at the Game Center last week, we had Jesper Juhl, who's also who is, I should say, he's a very, very well-known.
We had him 2 weeks ago.
Oh, did he do any of his exercises? He did some exercises with our students. He did a workshop for well, we had him for a longer period, so maybe that's
because now he's at MIT. Yes, because
yes.
it's easier for you. Yes,
but he did an interesting exercise where he said, okay, think of a platform in a genre like, he said, first person or single player smartphone games, and he said, what are our expectations that a single player smartphone game is going to have? Well, that it's, you can play it in short activity, that it's sort of an easy interface, that you're using the touch screen. And maybe sound is optional because you might not have headphones. So all of these kind of things. He said, okay, let's go deeper. Like what would break those expectations? What are things that would break those expectations? So it might be like, well, you have to play the game for an hour and you cannot pause or quit. Maybe an expectation is the game will not look at your personal information that's on your phone. But what if it breaks that, right? So the exercise was, in small groups, people had to think, okay, what is an expectation that we can break? And so then they were coming up with ideas based on a phone looking at your personal data, violating your privacy, basically. But then what could you do with that? Well, then I'm in a game where all the NPCs are based on my actual data on my phone. So I'm meeting my friends, right? So what was interesting is that people came up with really interesting ideas. Now, this doesn't quite address, Adi, your question about core mechanics, because that's more on the concept side. So that was a great way of generating concepts. I think my methodology is have people prototyping as soon as you possibly can. So getting to that, you should base design decisions on an actual working prototype. So that's my whole method as a designer is, how can I get this concept into something playable as soon as possible? And then you use the play of it to figure out what's working, what's not working, and to evolve the core mechanic. So so that's, yeah. And I guess, I don't know if you mean by introduce, I don't know if you mean introduce during development or to the player in a finished game, like how do you tutorialize them? But in terms of development, it's really that iterative process.
I meant more like to the player and to introduce them like in a kind of like subtle ways that it's not like pushing them like here, press here and jump, but like in a more subtle ways.
Yeah, I guess I'll say that designing tutorialization is itself a huge part of game design. So I think what often happens, especially in student projects, is that you kind of save that to the very end and it's not as successful. But the more experimental and the more unusual the experience that you're making, the more necessary it is to really think about how people are going to learn the experience that you're designing. When architect Natalie Putzi and I are working on those large-scale installations, I would say that about 50% of my time and effort as a game designer is spent on the tutorialization. Because it's in a museum situation or gallery situation, people don't want to read rules, they don't want to learn anything. So how do you get them to like start playing and to understand how a game works? And it's a huge part of my focus. And I developed that again through iteration. You just have to do a lot of testing with people that have never seen your game before. And it's really hard to do that. But I think there's a lot of good general best practices, integrating it. You want information just in time, integrated into the gameplay. You want to give people a place to practice. So we have some level design units in our school here at NYU, and my focus when I'm teaching level design, and it's not like 3D modeling and stuff, it's much more like a 2D or 3D package. Like for example, they're making levels in Portal 2, the Portal 2 engine or something like that. My focus is make a level that teaches someone a new concept through the level design, and then make another level that leverages that knowledge to do something more complicated. So I think the challenging thing, Adi, is that there's really not one answer, but that kind of level design challenge is a way of training or practicing this idea of how do you teach somebody something, which I think is how you communicate ideas through images, through gameplay. It's a huge part of being a designer. So practicing those kinds of skills, I think, is really important.
Thank you very much.
Rick, thank you very much.
That's it, I guess. We're a little bit out of line. Wow. Thank you so much, Eric Zimmerman. There's a million questions. I wrote it down. I'm not going to ask you now. You are welcome to come over to Tel Aviv. And now we can ask you in person. Okay.
Great.
With better accommodation this time, Eric.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Shenkar is located at the Central. It's different. Okay.
Nice.
Okay, so good evening to all our students and have a good day. Thank you so much, Eric.
This was really a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And good luck with your studies and projects and everything. I look forward to seeing them.
Thank you. Good luck with your book. It looks really interesting, really amazing. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for the sneak peek.
We will all break the rules.
Yes.
Oh yeah, you all were the ones to see it very, very first. So
thank
take
you.
We will
care,
write
everybody.
reviews about it, Eric.
Okay.
We will be the first reviewers.
Right. Bye bye,
Okay,
everybody.
thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.